The movie begins by showing an 8-year-old Stanley walking into the school gate. Stanley attended a public school that provided free education for underprivileged children like him. He often came to school wearing a shabby uniform with a little bruised face, but only a few people knew the reason behind it. Stanley was a bright and diligent kid who always came to school earlier than the other students. He always reviewed lessons the day before or just drew cards, which had long been his hobby. That morning, all students had attended, then the school bell sounded. As the class leader, Stanley walked forward to the front of the class and led the other students to pay his respects to their teacher. That day, Rosie, an English teacher, would give a lesson to the students in Stanley's class. Miss Rosie was known as a very affectionate and fun teacher, so it's no surprise that many students were comfortable with the learning she provided in class. She was also known to be a very affectionate and caring teacher. Many of the students at the school liked her. As a teacher who always paid attention to the students in her class, Miss Rosie realized that lately, Stanley often came to school with a bruised face. She became worried and tried to ask Stanley about the bruises. Stanley said the bruises were only caused by his accidental fall from the school bus. Miss Rosie also felt relieved and asked Stanley to be more careful. She also told him to compress the bruises to recover quickly. During break time, Stanley accidentally met a teacher in a toilet named Bobby Verma, who looked at him with a very cynical look. Mr. Verma was known as a rigorous and very killer Indian language teacher. Many students were afraid of him. Furthermore, Mr. Verma was also very greedy and couldn't resist being hungry when he smelled food. Even worse was he often came to Stanley's class to ask for food from the students by force. The students had no choice but to give their food. After the break, Stanley and his classmates started taking a natural science class taught by Miss Iyer. As she walked around the classroom, Miss Iyer found several pages in Stanley's textbook that had disappeared. Stanley explained that his little sister accidentally tore the book's pages last night, and fortunately, Miss Iyer understood the situation. She knew that Stanley was a very diligent student and always learned well despite his limitations. After the natural science lesson, Mr. Verma had a turn to teach Indian lessons in Stanley's class. All the students seemed tense as he entered the room. When Mr. Verma was busy explaining the material in front of the class, a student who felt hungry secretly took out his lunchbox and took a pinch of food to eat. Stanley, who saw what his classmates were doing, was worried because he was sure that soon Mr. Verma would smell the food. As Stanley predicted, Mr. Verma smelled the food and started to lose control. He should have focused on the lessons he gave. He shouted in front of the class and asked which students had unpacked the food during the study. However, because none of the students were willing to confess, Mr. Verma rushed out of the classroom and stole one of the other teachers' food supplies in the locker room. Mr. Verma crammed the food down as if he had not eaten for days, even though he knew the lunch pack did not belong to him. He never brought his own lunch pack to school. He also did not care about the education of children. The only thing that seemed very important to him was the lunch pack belonging to the students and teachers at the school. Most teachers and students always brought their own lunch pack, considering that the school only provided cooperatives that sell snacks. However, Mr. Verma preferred to avoid getting his lunch packed and instead stole food from other students or teachers. At break time, all the students started opening their lunch boxes, but Stanley was the only student who didn't bring lunch packed and could only see his friends enjoying their meals. One of Stanley's classmates, who was aware of it, intended to share his lunch with Stanley, but Mr. Verma instead snatched the food and kicked Stanley out of the class. On his way home, Stanley, who had not eaten anything all day, could only walk limply, watching the other kids flock to buy snacks and soft drinks at the school tavern. The following day, Stanley again didn't bring lunch. His classmates handed out their lunch pack to him. Although Stanley initially hesitated to accept the food, he took it with pleasure when he learned that Mr. Verma did not come to their class. At that time, Mr. Verma was in the teacher's room and asking for food from lunch pack owned by other teachers. The teachers were annoyed by Mr. Verma's behavior. They were also bothered to see the gluttony and the way he ate. That day, Stanley's friend invited him to play football after school, but Stanley rejected it because he had to ask his mother's permission first. His friend, who had a cell phone, then lent Stanley a cell phone so he could ask his mother for permission. Stanley had to pretend to call someone and pretend that his mother allowed him to go to the soccer game. One day, Miss Rosie saw an English essay written by Stanley. She was so amazed by his creativity that she gave Stanley chocolate as a gift. Before the English lesson ended, Miss Rosie said that after the Christmas break, they would get extra classes, and their classes would last longer than usual. Miss Rosie asked the students to prepare a more packed lunch because they would be home later than usual. The other day when Miss Rosie was on her birthday, all the students in Stanley's class congratulated her, while Stanley recited a poem that he had been making himself all night. Feeling impressed by Stanley's verse, Miss Rosie thanked him and gave him a chocolate. After school, Stanley kindly shared the chocolate with his friends, and he felt pleased to share the happiness with others. After a long Christmas vacation, school started again, and the new school year arrived. At that moment, the parents would prepare more lunch packs so their children could enjoy the food in the additional class later. On the first day of extra lessons, all students were required to place their lunch packed in class to make Mr. Verma feel less focused. Instead of concentrating on giving the subject matter to all students, Mr. Verma was busy talking about the food menu of the students' lunch in the class. During break time, Mr. Verma rushed to Stanley's classroom to ask for lunch for the students. But since Mr. Verma had been intercepted by Miss Iyer while walking through the school hallway, he was late to come to Stanley's class. As he arrived, he found that all the food belonging to the students had run out. Mr. Verma, upset with the situation, vented his frustration to Stanley. He accused him of being a thief for taking the rest of the meal given by his classmates. The incident traumatized Stanley. The following day, Stanley decided to avoid his classmates and pretend to have lunch outside the classroom. Having no money to buy food that afternoon, Stanley could only stay silent behind the school fence. Instead, Mr. Verma greedily ate Stanley's friend's lunch packed. One day, one of his friends caught Stanley standing alone on the side of the road at lunchtime. Stanley's friends, who felt sorry, asked why he didn't bring lunch. Stanley replied that his mother was going out of town, so no one could prepare lunch for him. After learning of Stanley's troubling condition, his classmates handed out their lunch supplies to Stanley. They would do that secretly without Mr. Verma's knowledge so Stanley wouldn't be repeatedly nagged by Mr. Verma. The following day at lunchtime, Mr. Verma came to Stanley's class. He looked astonished to learn that all the students were no longer in their classes. He searched various places around the school but did not find them. Unfortunately, one day, Mr. Verma managed to see Stanley and his friends enjoying their lunch in an abandoned warehouse on the school's roof. When Mr. Verma found out that Stanley was getting food from his classmates, he was furious and asked Stanley not to come to school until he could bring his own lunch. Since that incident, Stanley has been completely absent from school. He was terrified that he would get into trouble again with Mr. Verma. That really made Stanley's friends feel very angry with Mr. Verma. One day, the teachers at the school began to realize that Stanley had been skipping school for a few days, but they didn't know how to contact him. They regretted Stanley's decision to drop out of school when the school exam was about to arrive, and Stanley was one of the most intelligent students in the school. The other day, Stanley accidentally met his schoolmates, who told him that their class was going to hold a school play in a moment. On hearing that, Stanley secretly paid attention to the drama exercises conducted by his classmates from a distance and tried to memorize every movement they performed. Miss Rosie, who was worried about Stanley, asked his classmates. They told Miss Rosie about how Mr. Verma treated Stanley. After learning all that, Miss Rosie felt very angry with Mr. Verma and scolded him because he had made a genius student skip school because of the very lunch thing. She also said that she planned to report his actions to the principal. Soon, Mr. Verma got a direct reprimand from the principal. At the same time, Stanley started practicing dancing and putting on a drama performance in a place where the other students used to practice. A dance choreographer, who saw him dancing, gave Stanley a hand and taught him how to dance better. A few days later, Stanley finally returned to school after he managed to bring his own lunch packed as Mr. Verma had previously instructed. Stanley was pleased because it was the first time he could get lunch at school. Stanley then showed his lunch and distributed the food to Mr. Verma. He asked Mr. Verma whether he had been allowed to go to school again. That innocent question from Stanley became a hard slap for Mr. Verma, who immediately cried when he realized his mistakes to Stanley all along. Feeling guilty for him, Mr. Verma resigned from the school and quit his job as a teacher. When the students were performing plays at the end of the semester, Stanley was also serving in the show. All the teachers appeared to be amazed by their performances. In the evening, after the play performance, Miss Rosie approached Stanley and offered him a ride to take him home. But he rejected the offer and said his mother had been waiting for him in the car, as if he was hiding something from Miss Rosie. Shortly after Miss Rosie left, the principal came to Stanley and drove him home. In the end, the reality of Stanley's real life begins to unfold. He was actually an orphan child and had no home. Stanley was a child laborer who had to work dishwashing at a restaurant owned by his uncle. Every day, Stanley's uncle treated him badly and often beat him up whenever he accidentally made a mistake or was late for work. This was also the reason why he often had bruises on his face. But Stanley always hid all the truth from his friends. Stanley hid his difficult and sad life from everyone at his school. He didn't want to be pitied. Fortunately, the chef who worked at Stanley's uncle's restaurant was an excellent young man. He always helped Stanley prepare his lunch packed from leftovers sold at their restaurant. The chef promised to keep the lunch packed from Stanley's uncle so he wouldn't get in trouble. After all the bad things that had happened to him, Stanley was always grateful for every little happiness he brought. One of them was when Stanley could come to school with his own lunch packed to attend lessons without having to endure hunger again. More than that, Stanley often shared the delicious food he got from the restaurant with other students, teachers, to school janitors at school. The moral that can be learned from this movie is to remember to always be grateful for what you have in life. Not a few people out there wish to have something that we have.